In the first chapter, we discussed the 5 ways of acquiring a knowledge, the scientific method being the primary way that we should obtain knowledge in this profession. In Chapter 2, we discussed how to formulate social work research questions that can be answered by the scientific method. In this chapter, we will explore the various issues that you must address when answering these questions using the scientific method, focusing specifically on ethics. Concern for ethical practices with research conducted on people is not a new idea and can be traced as far back as 5 BC. The Hippocratic Oath, which is an ethical code attributed to the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, was adopted as a guide to conduct by the medical profession throughout the ages, and is still used in the graduation ceremonies of many medical schools. In the Nuremberg war criminal trials that occurred post-World War II, this is an example that merely having an ethical code was not enough to ensure ethical practices. The Nuremberg war crime criminal trials were held between 1945 and 1949 and exposed horrific experiments conducted by Nazi doctors on human subjects. A more recent event that occurred as late as 1972 in the U.S. sparked outrage with regards to how human beings were treated for the sake of research was the Tuskegee experiment. For 40 years, between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted an experiment on 399 black men in the late stages of syphilis. These men, for the most part, were illiterate sharecroppers from one of the poorest counties in Alabama. They were never told what the disease they were suffering from was or its seriousness. They were told that they were being treated for bad blood, and their doctors had no intention of ever curing them of syphilis, even though there was a cure. The data for the experiment was to be collected from the autopsies of the men once they passed. The study was meant to discover how syphilis affected blacks as opposed to whites. Based on these historical events, it was clear that a formal review procedure was needed to protect research participants. The U.S. government created a National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. In 1979, the Belmont Report was created to establish 3 ethical principles: respect for persons, minimizing possible harm and maximizing benefits, and distributing benefits and risks of research fairly. It is the responsibility of the researcher of not hurting any of your research participants is squarely on your shoulders. You must always remember that their safety comes first and your research project second. If you want to know research participants how they're really behaving when no one else is looking, you'll have to deceive them into believing that they are not being watched. You may be able to think of multiple ways to create this situation. However, coercion is not ethically acceptable. In 1963, Milgram was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Stanley Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced in committing atrocities like the ones that happened in World War II with the Germans. Volunteers were recruited for a lab experiment investigating learning. Participants were 40 males aged 20 and 50, between 20 and 50, and earned just $4.50 for showing up. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to another participant who was actually a confederate of the experimenter, or Milgram. They drew straws to determine their roles, either the learner or the teacher, although this was fixed and the confederate was always the learner. There was also an experimenter, dressed in a gray lab coat, played by an actor. 2 rooms in the laboratory were used, one for the lecturer with the electric chair and another for the teacher and the experimenter with the electric shock generator. The learner was strapped to a chair with electrodes. After he learned a list of word pairs given to him, the teacher tests him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner pair from the list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of the shock each time. The learner gave mainly wrong answers on purpose, and for each of these the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock to the experimenter, he or she was given a series of orders to ensure they continued. Interesting enough, 83.7% of the participants in the study surveyed later said they were very glad to have participated, even though they were coerced, and no physical harm came to the actual participants. However, these findings were not supported, and the need to eliminate deception from research was developed. Bribery, deception, and other forms of coercion are not accepted in research. Ingredients of informed consent: there are 16 bits of information that must be provided in plain and simple language to a potential research participant before research has begun. Each of these will be covered. A written consent form is used to inform potential research participants of their roles in the study and the rights they have if they volunteer to participate. Informed consent is the process by which potential participants are given all the information they need to decide whether to participate in the study or not. Information given should include the purpose of the study, procedures involved, potential risks and benefits. Informed consent must also ensure all participants that there are no ramifications if they choose not to participate and can discontinue their participation at any time. 16 bits of information must be provided in clear, plain language, and they are: number 1, the participants are being asked to participate in a research study. 2, the participation is voluntary, and the participant may discontinue participation at any time without penalty or loss of benefits to which he or she is otherwise entitled. And number 3, the names of the investigators and their affiliations. Number 4, the purposes of the research, simply explained. Number 5, what procedures will be used. Number 6, the extended duration of the participation. Number 7, any reasonably foreseeable risks or discomforts. Number 8, any safeguards to minimize the risks. Number 9, any benefits to the participant or to others that may reasonably be expected from the research study. In most cases, the study is not being performed for the benefit of the participant, but for the potential benefit of others. This broader social benefit to the public should be made explicit. Number 10, in cases where an incentive is offered, a description of the incentive and how and under what conditions it is to be obtained. Number 11, appropriate alternative procedures or courses of treatment if applicable. Number 12, the extent, if any, to which confidentiality of records identifying the participants will be maintained. It's not an issue unless the participants can be identified. Number 13, any restrictions on confidentiality. For example, if any of the information gained during the study might have to be disclosed as required by law. As incident in child abuse, in such cases, absolute confidentiality can be assured. Number 14, what monetary compensation or medical or psychological treatment will be provided for any research-related injury. Number 15, contact information for questions about the study, name, office address, phone contacts for the researcher, faculty, and IRB staff. And last but not least, 16, that the researcher will keep one copy of the signed consent form and give another signed copy back to the participant. As mentioned previously, informed consent is the process by which potential participants are given all the information they need to decide whether or not to participate in the study. Maintaining privacy and confidentiality is key for protecting research participants. This means that nobody but the research personnel should have access to the information that could link responses to their respondents. These are examples of research studies that could potentially have issues with maintaining privacy. For example, if you're asking about a person's sexual preferences, you're asking about alcohol or drug-related practices, you ask parents to share their feelings about a child who has disability, if you're exploring marital status issues or a person's sexual orientation, or maybe you're exploring a person's diagnosis, whether it's mental illness, cognitive disability, or physical condition. We must always ensure confidentiality. This diagram explores each of the steps in designing a study in an ethical manner. It is important to understand that each step overlaps with others. Therefore, it is impractical to discuss ethical issues within each step separate from the other steps, because all steps are influenced by the ethical decisions made. Each of these steps will be further discussed in the next several slides. Designing the study in an ethical manner. Step 1. Develop the research question. Refine the research question through the literature and evaluate the literature. We must answer the following questions. What is the purpose of our research study? Will it increase our understanding of the problem? And does this research benefit any groups involved in the process? If the study does not directly or indirectly benefit its participants or contribute to the professional social work knowledge, then it would be considered an unethical and would not be approved by the IRB. In step 2, we select a research approach. During our literature review, it is the best way to identify potential research methods to use for our own research. It is our responsibility to select a research approach that will produce useful, reliable, and valid findings. Step 3, specify how variables are measured and being aware of cultural issues. In selecting variables, we may also find this information from our literature review. We need to avoid measurement methods and instruments with obvious bias, such as those that limit participation to only a specific group of people. We must also be culturally aware when developing our research questions, establishing our procedures, collecting and analyzing our data. For example, we must take into account any potential study participants' perception about a sensitive topic, such as child abuse, and use this information to develop not only our research questions, but recruiting our participants, how we collect and analyze our data. Language is also an important cultural consideration. We must ensure that we take all steps necessary to ensure that each participant has equal access to the study, regardless of the language or the dialect they speak. This will be more carefully discussed in Chapter 4. Step 4. Select a sample. Recruitment. Select a sample. Sampling methods are often dictated by our study's purpose, and are also influenced by our own personal values. We must ensure research participants a representative of the target population that we want to study intentionally, being sure to not intentionally excluding individuals or groups from participating. This can affect our research findings and ability to communicate those findings to our colleagues. For recruiting purposes, consent and assent processes, mission on the possibility of coercion or undue influence, and potential privacy procedures and completeness must be discussed. Step 5. Select a research design. Benefits, equipoise, or the uncertainty principle in deception. For a research design, participants may often be randomly assigned to one or two groups: the experimental group, which receives the intervention, or the control group, which does not receive treatment or receives the old treatment. It is unethical to withhold an intervention that has already been demonstrated to be effective. Eliminate unethical practices. The control group would receive the best current intervention as possible to the experimental intervention. This is referred to as beneficence, or being able to maximize the benefits and minimize harm to participants. Equipoise is a principle that maintains that research groups should be conducted only if there is true uncertainty about which treatment alternative is most likely to benefit them. For example, if it is well known that one group will receive a treatment that is known to be superior over an alternative treatment, that would be unethical to assign a participant to the inferior treatment. For deception, it is good practice to never lie to your research participants. However, providing full disclosure is not often feasible in every study. Debriefing our participants after the study is over is one way of counteracting deception, any deception that may be involved. Step 6. Select a data collection method. How data are collected, who will collect the data, and frequency and timing of data collection. How data are collected. The researchers choose how data is collected based on the review of literature and research questions. Being aware of any potential bias that might arise, such as possible coercion or exclusion of participants, is key to deciding how and when to collect the data. Who will collect the data? Anyone in position of power or authority over the participant can potentially influence their responses. For example, let's say a teacher is giving a survey to his or her students to express their opinions of his or her grading practices. Some of the answers given by the students to the questionnaire may be based on fear that how they respond may impact their grade if a negative perception is shared. The frequency and timing of data collection. Data should be collected at different intervals to maximize the chance of participation equity. Step 7. Analyze the data. The following guidelines in data analysis can be used to ensure ethical practices are followed. Research findings and results should be presented openly and honestly. This includes avoiding or leaving out any contradictory information. Untrue or deceptive statements should be avoided in all reports. The limits and boundaries of interference should be deleted clearly. This may include considerations of the subject sample for participation or the levels of experimental variables. Complete and clear documentation must be provided on how the data was edited, any statistical procedures used, and any assumptions made about the data. And finally, the role of the data analysis is ideally neutral, so the statistical procedures may be applied without concern for favorable outcome. Step 8. Write and disseminate the research report. The Code of Ethics calls for us to report our findings to the research participants and the community that benefit from our findings at all times. Federal regulations require that every institution that seeks federal funding for biomedical or behavioral research on human subjects must have an Instructional Review Board, or IRB. The IRB at NC State has a mission to facilitate compliant research with human subjects. It's accomplished through three primary goals. First, to protect the rights and the welfare of human research subjects through project review. Second, to foster compliance with instructional policy and federal regulations. Third, to provide education to instructional personnel on the ethical use of human subjects. Measures of the research results can be justified by decisions already made any public relation issues that need to be addressed, performance appraisals, or fulfilling funding requirements.